Today's World Insight with Tian Wei. Lagarde officially steps down as IMF chief to become the European Central Bank president. What can we expect from her successor? And we speak to two American scholars of Chinese economics. Can U.S.-China trade talks conclude with a photo finish?
That doesn't help us, and it certainly doesn't help the integrity of the multilateral system.
Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you from Beijing on CGTN. We begin today's program with Christine Lagarde. After leading the International Monetary Fund for 8 years, she has stepped down to become president of the European Central Bank. During her tenure with the IMF, China became the IMF's third largest shareholder behind only U.S. and Japan, and China's currency has been included in the IMF special drawing rights basket. Her resignation also left the organization with major challenges, one of which is to keep peace between IMF's two most important member states, the United States and China. Take a look.
Amid a leadership scandal and the Eurozone crisis, the then French finance minister, Christine Lagarde, stepped into the global spotlight in 2011 as the 11th managing director of the International Monetary Fund. Skeptics questioned her lack of formal training in economics, while supporters praised her political skills that bring people across convictions to consensus. In the crowds of world leaders, Ms. Lagarde often stands out as the first female head of the IMF and became the most well-known spokesperson for the fund. Under her leadership in 2016, the IMF added the Chinese renminbi to the basket of currencies that make up the special drawing right, elevating the yuan's international status. As Ms. Lagarde moves on to the head of the European Central Bank, her poised successor, Kristalina Georgieva, will not only inherit her legacy, but also her challenges. Multilateral bodies such as the IMF are under greater scrutiny. However, most pressingly, the IMF is concerned with a predicted global economic slowdown.
A so-called trade war, driven by reciprocal increases in import tariff, gives no winner. And we find generally losers on both sides.
As the ongoing trade conflict between the world's two largest economies drags on, the world's last resort lender is facing increasing pressure.
For more on the future of the IMF, I'm joined in London Professor Ian Begg, a research fellow at the European Institute of London School of Economics and Political Science. And in New York, we have Max Wolf, managing partner at Multivariate. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. Professor Wolf, I would like to go to you first about the future of the IMF. With the change of person as the managing director, what do you say? There will be directional change, or likely there's going to be a continuous path from the earlier approach?
So I think we're going to see a lot of similar approach, but I do think it's a milestone and a good one that we have somebody in charge of an organization that primarily is tasked with helping the economic development of developing countries, which for the first time is a person who's from a developing country, not a war-ravaged developed country or a wealthy developed country, but a developing country. And I also think it's pretty interesting to have somebody who was trained outside of the usual universities, which is also a first. The few American or European universities that have trained almost everyone who's been in charge of a Bretton Woods institution. And I also think it's a good hopeful sign to see that we have someone who has studied and who has taught, both in the U.S. and China, as the various frictions between those two largest shareholders have been more than a little bit problematic from a global economic development perspective in the last little while.
Right. Professor Begg, of course, Ms. Georgieva is one coming from a developing economy, but at the same time, she's been having a lot of experience with the World Bank, particularly on development issues and on issues like climate change. So what do you think there might be some of the earlier experiences carried over to the current post, while at the same time, certainly as managing director of IMF, there are special qualities that the leader should have of this organization?
Well, I think I'd reinforce what you've just been told, that she is a breath of fresh air. I've met her a couple of times, and she's a very charismatic woman. Her background, not just in the World Bank, but also in her time at the European Commission, ranged across various economic development portfolios, but she was also at one stage the European Commissioner for a budget, so she knows how to control money as well as the priorities inside trying to foster economic development. Now, yes, the world is moving towards a green agenda. It follows that the IMF is going to have to follow that as well, and therefore thinking about green finance, thinking about new ways of innovating to try to get a more climate-friendly approach, that's bound to be part of the IMF's next stages of development.
Right. Now, Professor Wolf, Ms. Lagarde, the earlier managing director of IMF, was quite well known throughout her tenure as someone who's daring to speak out against even some of the very strong economies and members of the IMF, to say the least. Now, what do you make of her approach? Is that unique among all managing directors of IMF? Are we going to see that also reflected through the future generations of IMF and managing directors at a time of dramatic change we have witnessed in the world, Professor?
Yes, so I do think we're going to see that. I think that the new candidate in Georgieva is probably quite promising in that regard. I think that the IMF has gone through a crisis. I wouldn't lay it at the feet of either of these women, but has gone through a bit of a crisis of relevance and legitimacy. In the best of times, the world is awash with inexpensive credit, and that makes the role of the IMF somewhat less obvious to some folks around the world who need to believe in it in all market conditions. And then when the markets get really tight, there's been a proclivity of the IMF to be very doctrinaire and orthodox in the economic advice, and also to be an easy target of blame for various governments around the world. So the IMF needs to show it is more sensitive to realities on the ground and more relevant to the concerns of the people, the vast majority of the world's population, that is dealing with the crises, economic and climatic, to be honest, in a developing world context. And I think we're going to have to see a little bit more strident of a voice, and I do think that we probably have someone in the new director here who is very promising in that regard.
Professor Beck, though, if you look at Ms. Georgieva's past record, one could certainly notice some kinds of bravery in terms of pushing the right policy at the right places. However, if you think about the challenges she and the IMF is facing right now, there was an earlier transition from US dollar to a basket of currency that the IMF would embrace as the major currencies around the world. Of course, during the earlier tenure of Ms. Lagarde, some of the developing countries, China's, for example, voting rights has been improved, or improved at least to a certain percentage. But there are still a lot of things undone yet, particularly at a time of great transition. Professor Beck, how much change can this generation of managing director of IMF still have the room to push?
Well, I think it's an incremental process. Change at the big institutions like the IMF only happens relatively slowly, because you also have to remember that those countries such as, let's say, Belgium and Europe, which have a disproportionate voting weight, are going to be very reluctant to lose it. So you have to massage their feelings and egos at the same time as you try to promote the emerging countries, which naturally expect that they should have bigger amounts. But there's also the day-to-day business of the IMF. It has to think about the problems it's facing with potentially a slowing global economy. The IMF has been warning about that now for some time. The fact that there are some countries which are recurrent difficulties for them, not least Argentina now very much back at the top of the agenda. How to deal with countries which ought to be doing better, like Argentina, if you can't impose the kind of conditions that the IMF has traditionally imposed. These are delicate questions of governance that only evolve relatively slowly.
Yeah. If you think about what's going on right now, particularly the relationship, Professor Wolf, since you are based in the U.S. right now, between China and the United States. Now, two important economies certainly in the world, and important members as well of the IMF, are not on necessarily good terms, and not to mention the geopolitics on a bigger scale. So one would assume that the managing director of IMF would have a lot of struggles and challenges in front of her in order to bring everybody online.
So absolutely. I mean, this is a uniquely difficult moment to have the responsibility and the opportunity of being in charge of the IMF. I mean, I think we all kind of realize that some of the traditional safeguards around freedom of trade and freedom of economic commerce around the world and advocates for globalization, particularly voices inside the United States and to some degree inside Europe and the United Kingdom particularly, have gone from proponents to opponents of free trade in a moment where we sit pretty near what could be a global growth recession. And the combination of a growth recession and a hardening and hostility to the world and growing nationalism, along with climate change, probably are the three great threats that you encounter in this job. And it's nearly certain that very quickly in the tenure she will encounter various combinations, hopefully non-lethal, but various combinations of those challenges to her ruling, her leadership, and also just to the organization and the Bretton Woods system writ large, including but not limited to the IMF.
Now, China's economy slowed down, but it's still the largest and one of the largest and also fastest developing economies, driving force of the global economy. But the U.S. economy also likely to slow down, unlike the earlier Professor Begg prediction of the IMF suggesting more than 3.6%. Now it's probably only 2%. So what does it say to a global slowdown, which the managing director of IMF should consider and put out proposals related to that? Professor Begg, briefly.
Well, unfortunately, only for the major economies like China and the U.S., the same really applies to the European Union. The IMF can only advise, cajole, and try to persuade. It doesn't have the instruments to reboot the American economy or the Chinese economy. That's right. Down in the U.S. case to the combination of the Fed and the U.S. Treasury. So it's about persuasion, but also looking where there might be damage going on in the rest of the world and being ready to intervene if, let's say, without being unreasonable, Brazil gets into difficulty because of some complications going on there, or somewhere in Africa has difficulties, or Southeast Asia.
BRICS?
These are the areas where the IMF is expected to intervene.
Or Brexit, sorry, or Brexit.
Well, no, I just don't see the IMF being part of the response to Brexit. I thought we were going to avoid that topic today for once, but you insisted.
It's all entangled, I'm afraid. And gentlemen, last year I did have the opportunity to talk to Kristalina Georgieva when she was still serving in the World Bank. Let's listen in to what she had to say, an excerpt of our earlier discussion. There's so much debate about whether the existing system is still functioning or not. There's so much debate about whether we still need the multilateralism. Maybe we should just go our countries first. There's so much debate about, is still World Bank relevant today? What do you think?
Well, let me make 3 points. One, our shareholders voted with their checkbooks on whether the World Bank is relevant or not. We just got the highest in our history capital increase, 50% boost of our financial capacity. Second, the problems we face today and we will be facing tomorrow, climate change, the health of our oceans, our ability as a world community to live sustainably, none of these problems individual countries can solve on their own. Trading in a fair manner, we cannot do that as individual countries. Therefore, cooperation is a must. In this ocean we swim today, we are all in the same boat. And it is impossible to turn to you and say, you know what, your end of the boat is sinking, but I'm just fine. Interdependence calls for cooperation. and cooperation makes everybody better off.
So obviously, gentlemen, you could tell from her earlier answer to my questions, she puts in a lot of emphasis on gender equity, climate change issues, the ocean, and some of the public goods issues when she was serving at the World Bank. Will those issues, from what angle the IMF could better, so in a way, provide answers to? What do you think, Professor Wolf?
Yes, so I think the IMF has shown a pretty rapid maturation in the sophistication in which it deals with those issues lately. But I think we've had a long period, in which the IMF was somewhat doctrinaire in the notion that growth was really the job. All growth would be pro-poor growth. All growth would be equity enhancing across ethnic, religious, and gender divisions. And I think we've found that that's quite rarely the case. So it's exciting when that occurs. It does occur sometimes, but it's probably the exception as opposed to the rule. And so I think being sensitive to the fact that one of the major exogenous shocks that economies may face will be climactic, and we've already seen that, and we're going to see more of it. And that growth alone, without some distributional consciousness, is probably the wrong medicine for the ailments of the 21st century.
Well said. Professor Begg, your thoughts?
Inequality is going to be one of the main big topics for international governance. I think that we've seen that from all kinds of angles. Second, I would say that Kristalina will have to work closely with the other institutions, and it's a great advantage to her, having been across the road in Washington at the World Bank previously to joining the IMF. And at the same time, the IMF itself, which is predominantly an organ to deal with macroeconomic issues, has to be aware of how it imposes its conditionality on countries in ways which could be adverse for growth, adverse for equality, and adverse for the kind of gender mainstreaming that she would like to see in her new portfolio. So these are just three of the big headings that she will have to confront.
I see. Ian Begg, Max Wolf, what a pleasure. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program, we speak to two American scholars of Chinese economics. Can U.S.-China trade talks conclude with a photo finish? Well, that probably is the wish. We'll be back after this. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We turn to China-U.S. trade tensions, which are showing signs of easing, at least some believe. U.S. President Donald Trump said he would delay new tariffs from October the 1st to October the 15th toward China. China welcomes the U.S. gesture of goodwill. Earlier, China had announced a list of 16 U.S. items to be excluded from tariffs and said both sides are gearing up for another round of negotiations early next month in October. The conflict that started in March last year has disrupted global supply chains and rattled financial markets. But these recent moves indicate that China and the U.S. hope to resolve the trade row. So what will happen from now on until the upcoming talks, if there are any? Earlier, on the sidelines of China Development Forum held in Beijing, I spoke to two distinguished guests with different views. They're both from the U.S. The first, Scott Kennedy, who studied in China at the very beginning of the reform and opening up era, and is now senior advisor and trustee chair in Chinese business and economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He explained how best to comprehend the Trump administration's view on commerce, at least from his perspective. Let's listen in. Do you think that is likely to be the way the president thinks?
You know, obviously
Nobody can read his psychology, but...
I don't even think the best psychologist would be able to make out everything that he's thinking. But there is a basic logic to what he's doing. Partly it's political. He is a politician. Partly he's a deal maker, and he's trying to figure out how much pressure and he can put on China with different levers. At the same time, For 30 years, it's been very clear he's an economic nationalist. He thinks that the U.S. has been cheated by its trading partners, the Chinese, Europeans, Japan, reflected in big bilateral trade deficits, and that at the same time the U.S. has provided military support to its allies. And so he feels like the U.S. has been a victim the last 30-plus years, and so he's trying to redress that. It's a very different type of math than most use, but nevertheless, I think that genuinely motivates him to hold out for a bigger deal than many think. And I think even in Beijing, I've heard a lot of people ask me in and out of government, what happens when the U.S. stock market goes down? What happens when the president faces potential impeachment or questions like that? Will he lower his demands? And I think there's actually a pretty high floor below which he won't go in terms of his demands. Now, we can debate whether he should or he shouldn't, but just as an analyst, I don't think he's likely to lower them a lot. So then the question becomes, is China going to raise its offer? And there, I still think we've got a significant gap. Both sides still think they have the upper hand, which to me worries me, because I think given those conflicting expectations, this could be around with us for a while.
Now, a lot of the techniques used by the trade war between Japan and the United States back in the 1970s were being, quote-unquote, utilized this time as well, given the fact Mr. Lighthizer is the trade rep, and given the fact that there have been a lot of different voices in Washington. Mr. Kennedy, you studied very closely the history. How would you compare then and now, whether that is a smart choice?
Yeah, so I think you're exactly right, Tian Wei, that there are a lot of parallels born out of an experience from the 1980s vis-a-vis Japan. And there's several key components, several of which look very similar. Obviously, using tariffs or other types of arrangements against Japan and then against China, with the expectation that the American market is so large, so important, that that would have such an effect on Japan or China's economy in this case that they would have to make major concessions. Also doing it on our own, as opposed to doing it through back then the GATT or now the WTO, or with a group of countries plurilaterally vis-a-vis China. I think another thing that's really interesting now, and I can't speak for the 1980s, is that the negotiations now are intentionally by the American side kept to a very small group of people. And most of the time, if you go back during the most recent administrations, Bush, Obama, you would see hundreds and hundreds of negotiators on both sides. Now you're looking at very small groups. It's not good for the airline industry or hotel industry, but it's meant to focus the conversations around principles. But one of the challenges of that is the principals still need to have information, and they can't know everything. I think another reason that the U.S. wants to do that is that if they bring 100 negotiators to negotiation, the Chinese will negotiate with 100 people one by one and find all the weaknesses in the U.S. side. So actually, from the perspective of China experts within the U.S. government, it's a pretty quiet time. Go to work at 9, go home at 5, no weekend work, because you don't have to actually get ready to go to the negotiating table because you just have a few people there. And so limiting the negotiations has the benefit of really focusing attention on the decision makers. On the other hand, it's not clear that they have all the information that they should.
What kind of progress are we talking about if we look at the political agenda? For the U.S. election, it's the biggest thing. I mean, even say this election is ever more important than the last one. So what would that mean for the overall atmosphere, timeline, tactics, agenda, and goal of this negotiation?
Well, I tend to take a little bit different view than most folks. I know that America is a democracy, and every 4 years we have a big election, and our leaders calculate how different policy issues are going to affect their standing vis-a-vis voters in those elections, vis-a-vis business, what it's going to mean for the business cycle, and they want the economy to look good and for there to be successful deals just before elections. I understand that general logic, and I think President Trump is probably as sensitive to anybody about polls and his standing than just about anybody. I think he lives and breathes, walks, sleeps, polling, and how people look at him, right? That's critical for him. On the other hand, as I said before, he has some of these basic beliefs about the relationship with China and the U.S. relationship with the rest of the world, and the sense of unfairness. And so the election factor may lead him to moderate some of his positions at certain times. On the other hand, again, I think there's a floor beneath which he won't go because of those strong sentiments that he's held for a long time. So it's possible that as we get closer to the election, maybe he will soften a little bit, but I don't think we should over-expect that. On the same side, on the Chinese side, if China's economy softens, are we going to see China really relax its goals? I think the way out of that type of psychoanalysis is really just two sides figuring out what's in their best interest. Speeding up economic reform is good for China, regardless of whether the U.S. wants it. For the U.S., improving the relationship with China is good for the U.S. as well.
Mr. Kennedy, you've been doing research about China for a long time. But you are one of those very representative among the so-called younger generations of China hands.
Why, thank you. I'm not so young, but appreciate it.
But, you know, looking at where the relationship is,
yes.
What do you think going to be the nature of coexistence, in
yes.
a way,
yes.
between China and the United States? Because neither could destroy each other
Yes.
in the way that they want.
Yeah.
And therefore, the coexistence is a matter of fact.
Yes.
But how?
Well, I mean, I've been coming to China for 30-plus years. And, you know, I first went to school just down the street. And when I went to school there, China was an exciting place for me, very different from...
Maybe 5 or 6 blocks away from here.
Just very, very, not too far at all, really. We could walk there in a few minutes, probably. No private cars on the road, no restaurants, no hotels, very different. But there was a deep curiosity from Americans who were here, only a few hundred of us in the late 80s, from Chinese trying to learn about, you know, there were these salons and English corners and all types of creative exchanges going on. Actually, we knew a lot less about each other, but we were super curious in both directions. Taking a train in China in the 1980s was an opportunity to face interviewers tougher than you for hour after hour, but very exciting.
Yeah.
And
meaning the common people who want to approach
absolutely.
you and talk to you.
Sitting a hard seat from here to Guangzhou,
oh, wow.
That's a long time to get to talk to people.
You got one of those experiences?
Indeed.
Good for you.
Indeed, for terrific. Now you're on a high-speed train or a plane and you're not talking to anybody. It's actually not as
You're
fun.
on your phone most of the time.
I know, everyone's just doing this. So, and you're connected back to the United States or Europe, and you're not, you know, the environment is totally different. But now we are interconnected deeply. We are part of one world, one language, one community, one scientific world, and we have to figure out how to address these real challenges. We do have issues about who gets a little bit more, who gets a little bit less, what this means for the global macroeconomy, but we have some really big challenges that we both face. Obviously, everyone knows about climate change. Technological progress is good for everyone, but it also requires lots of changes. If you look at AI, automation, that means lots of people are going to not have jobs.
But they're not up for the job.
It's
They're not up for the job. That's the
right.
thing.
Yes, yes. So
are we going to disappoint our future generation in a big way?
I'm really worried about the rise of nationalism and populism in lots of places, east and west. I'm really worried about the inequality that is partly feeding into that, and that sense of unfairness and victimization that people who haven't been the winners feel, and is leading to a challenge of our political institutions, any sources of authority. We've got to address those. And so we need to play defense appropriately on old issues, but we need to play offense together on the new issues. Otherwise, the world as we know it right now will look a lot better compared to what it could be.
That's my interview with Scott Kennedy, Senior Advisor and Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. China and the U.S. ties is not just about any bilateral relationship. Since they are the world's two largest economies, this relationship is the backbone to international trade, but also adds more challenges, some say, to the reform of the systems. On the sidelines of the China Development Forum, I also spoke to Jeffrey Schott, Senior Fellow working on the international trade policy and economic sanctions at the Peterson Institute for International Economics based in Washington, D.C. He discussed the global trading system from an American viewpoint and see how the bilateral relations is having its impact on the reform of the WTO. Let's take a look. There are so many things on the agenda for the world regarding trade. For example, the reform of the WTO. Are we going to see different parallels of interaction between China and the United States at this moment, or the trade talk will totally absorb all the energy of the two countries?
The dispute settlement problem is a limited one. The appellate body will not be operative after December 11th. But that doesn't mean that the WTO cannot adjudicate disputes, and it will have the ability to issue rulings. Those rulings will not be able to be appealed. And so other countries can do workarounds. The European Union and Canada and other countries have been developing sort of parallel type of appellate processes.
But very small scale because the members involved over there.
Yeah, but it wouldn't apply to cases involving the United States.
Yes.
And that's where the discrimination and the dysfunction comes in. But the more important issue, and I mean, that's critical, and it has to be resolved because you have to have the United States be subject to enforcement. But the critical problem, which critically involves China and the United States, is that you can't update the rules unless China and the United States participate in that process and buy into that process and contribute to it. And if you don't have an updating of the rules, then more and more areas of commercial conflict will be unenforceable under the trading rules and will lead politicians to take extra legal actions, as we've seen by both the United States and the Chinese government.
Right. So are we going to see anything that's likely to happen in terms of WTO, or are we going to see, more practices like what Canada and some of the European countries have been doing, which is having smaller scale dispute settlement rules and body of their own, and therefore the future of the WTO probably is pretty much hanging in the air, Mr. Schott?
Well, there is a lot of work going on in the United States, some in Europe, and also quite a bit here in China on what is needed and how to update the WTO rulebook, which essentially been intact and unreformed for 25 years. That, I think, is very difficult to do with a U.S. administration that does not give priority to multilateral negotiations, or even plurilateral, where a group of countries would get together to try to develop new rules. I think another U.S. administration more committed to updating and reinforcing the multilateral trading system could find common cause with China on a number of important areas of international commerce that needs more discipline.
How much do you think there is the possibility of the United States unwillingly at this moment in terms of the administration's view to participate further in the WTO reform discussion. The other economies will team up, not just one or two or three, but rather in a bigger scale, be able to come up with something of their own, and the U.S. being left alone. Now, that's also another possibility some have been talking about.
I don't think it's...
Are you worried about that?
I'm not worried about it because they're at least thinking constructively, but not in a very practical manner. Because to have the system work or the new rules be effective, they have to apply to the United States and China.
Yeah.
And to have a system of rules that excludes the United States is effectively giving the United States a free ride and allowing us to continue to pursue extra legal activities. That doesn't help us, and it certainly doesn't help the integrity of the multilateral system.
What about that early October engagement again between the two negotiation teams? Should we have much expectation for that?
Well, I think both sides want to find a way to put a deal together to avoid hurting each other and hurting themselves. And the pain will just get worse and worse if we follow through with the threats to impose more tariffs by the end of this year. So the opportunity to sit down and talk and perhaps even negotiate a ceasefire would be beneficial.
Now, at this moment, Mr. Shaw, many believe, both sides still believe that they have an upper hand against each other, given the latest changes in economy picture. And then there's also the issue of the election. Well, at the same time, there seems to be a lot of lack of trust going on, particularly about the credibility issue, given some earlier agreements being somewhat hammered out and yet not necessarily being respected by either of the sides. So can we really expect any kinds of result? What are the two sides, when they're talking to each other, can depend on to hold on to some dim hope of the deal?
Well, there has been growing mistrust of each other during the course of the negotiations. And it's not just because of the natural up and downs of a negotiating process.
No.
That occurs in every negotiation. And sometimes you have to have a temporary failure to achieve a success afterwards. But what I think is more difficult to manage is that the scope of the friction has expanded. And so before we were talking about a set of trade issues. Now we are talking about that and high technology trade and investment that is of a different nature. And so that has deepened the divide between the two countries and has also gotten the attention of advisors more concerned with national security than with economic performance. And so within each country, I think there is tension in the decision-making process on how much one impairs your own economy to defend what is perceived as national security interests.
Talking about the technology, Mr. Shaw, since there's a key word there, Huawei has been an important thorny issue between China and U.S. Now, without much evidence, now the U.S. has sidelined Huawei, and also it seems that there has been enormous amount of difficulties for Huawei to continue its already existing operation, despite of its deals and agreements with the rural operators inside the United States. So how are we going to witness the future trend of this important case study?
Well, some of it we don't have because of the legal process. Some of it we don't have because of the national security concerns or the charges of impairment of national security. We know it will lead to disruptions, particularly, as you mentioned, in rural communities in the United States. And it will lead to some adjustments in supply chains. Huawei has a lot of suppliers from U.S. high technology firms.
But that's a national security issue, isn't it, in a way, that once you put that into a framework of so-called national security, there seems to be a lot of lack of information for anyone from outside the circle to have a judgment about the issue, and therefore make all the scholars and experts and people who know the trade difficult to get engaged and discuss and provide suggestions. Mr. Schott, I'm sure it's not just one case or two. How do you, as a trade expert, going to see this trend? Maybe there's Huawei, there's more to come, not just with China, maybe with other countries too.
Well, we were talking about restoring trust in our bilateral trade negotiations. I think there is an element that the Trump administration has to restore trust in its assessment of national security concerns. Because like the story of the boy who cried wolf, he cried wolf all the times when there wasn't a real emergency, and then when the emergency came, no one believed him because he had always cried wolf under less compelling circumstances. We have now seen the Trump administration cry wolf over national security concerns about steel and aluminum and automobiles. It is undermining the credibility of the national security determinations and at least raising doubts about the veracity of the charges. And so there has to be renewed confidence that when our leaders say this is important for national security and has to take precedence over everything else, that we regard it as credible and not just a political gesture.
Many people feel pessimistic about the short term. From a trade expert's perspective, how would you be able to pick up yourself every morning and still be able to try to provide solutions to many of the difficult problems we touch on?
The first thing is there is extensive concern all over the world, not just in Washington and Beijing, but in many, many other countries, about understanding the nature of the U.S.-China conflict and finding ways of helping to resolve it. When the two largest trading nations are in conflict and everyone else is being hurt by it. And I'm heartened by the fact that so many people are concerned, not only about the ramifications for their own country, but what the United States and China not working together means for the international system. And I think there are many people in both our countries that recognize that we have a responsibility. Bob Zoellick years ago called it responsible stakeholder for China, because he assumed naturally that the U.S. was a responsible stakeholder in the international system. Now I think we have to say both China and the United States have to be responsible stakeholders.
If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights across China and the world. And do enjoy both the weekend and the Mid-Autumn Festival. Bye for now.